Realizations. Hare Krishna, Prashanth Prabhu, over to you.
Hare Krishna Mataji, Hare Krishna devotees. Share my screen and let me know when you can see it.
Yes, Prabhu, we can see it.
Okay. So today we're, as Mataji said, we're talking about prayers of personified Vedas. This is Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 87, verse 1 through 50. And we'll start with invocation prayers. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshtarani Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivedanta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram Ram Hare Hare. And as we're reading from Bhagavatam, also invoke Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Thank you, Veena Mataji, Satsara Prabhu, just Mataji devotees for giving me this opportunity. If I make any mistakes or offenses, please forgive me beforehand. So this is a continuation of the first set of verses that we went through, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So this is, again, we are talking about, just to set the background, this is Maharaj Parikshit asking Sukadeva Goswami the question of how to understand the Supreme Lord when he is, ununderstandable through the Vedas, right? So we talked about last time how words have multiple meanings, and Prabhupada gives us different examples of why Parikshit is asking this question, and then, to answer the question, it becomes it's answered through disciplic succession, right? Through Vedic parampara. So to answer the question, Sukadeva Swami talks about how Sri Narada asked this question, and then Sri Narayana Rishi, who Sri Narada asked this question, talks about a time when the sages of Janaloka asked this question, and from that we get to the answer, which is given by the Vedas personified. So that's where this whole question and the through disciplic succession we get to hearing about the prayers of the personified Vedas. And last time we talked a little bit about who the personified Vedas are, and just as to remind everybody, it's the first emanation that's coming from Lord Mahavishnu, right? And when he exhales, and the first thing that comes out is the personified Vedas, and that's basically all of knowledge and all of everything in and personified as an actual living entity. So these personified Vedas are what are giving these prayers, and they're going to help us understand how we can understand Krishna, and how we can understand the ununderstandable, unknowable Lord. So we will start with I went through some verses last time, so this time going through some of the other verses, and we will just go through, quickly. We'll go through the Sanskrit, the English translation, and understanding and points from the purports by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. So we would start with 1087:15. So this is the Shrutis have the Shrutis, which are what the personified Vedas are called. They've already begun responding, and they've already started saying their prayers in verse 14. So this is verse 15. So in this verse, I will read here. So Brihad Upalabdam etat avayanti avesha satya yata yudatstam ayo vikrater midivai vikratat atar rashayo tadustvai mano vacha charitam vacha charitam katam ayata bhavanti bhuvidata padani nirnam. So the Shrutis say the perceivable world is identified with the Supreme because the Supreme Brahman is the ultimate foundation of all existence, remaining unchanged as all created things are generated from it and at last dissolved into it, just as clay remains unchanged by the products made from it and again merged with it. Thus, it is towards you alone that the Vedic sages direct all their thoughts, words, and acts. After all, how can the footsteps of men fail to touch the earth on which they live? So there are a few things that we can take away from this verse. So the first thing here is um, the Shrutis are explaining why Lord Krishna is alone is the absolute truth, right? So there's several words, if you go through the purports, that the Shrutis use in this in this verse that are helpful to us. So the first word is they use the word Dvai, which means you and you alone. And Prabhupada makes the distinction that and there's some other verses in Vedas where it says Indra is the supreme or Agni is the supreme, but here the Shrutis kind of clarify for us that it's Lord Krishna alone is the absolute truth. It says you alone. So that's kind of the first understanding that we can take away, that it's the supreme Brahman is Lord Vishnu and Lord Krishna. The second word that they use is Brahman or Brihat, meaning the greatest. And Prabhupada talks about this in the purports, where he says, it's uh, Lord Krishna and the Supreme Brahman is Brihat Brahman, which means it's the greatest source above all other sources. And ultimately, right, what we can take away is there's only one source of universal creation, right? That's what the Shrutis are referring to here. The next verse is Avasesha, which means the ultimate substance, or that remains regardless of expansion, transformation, or annihilation. So the Supreme Brahman is not going to change regardless of how much it expands, how much it transforms, how much it gets annihilated. So all of those things indicate the qualities of the Supreme Brahman, qualities of Lord Krishna. So the next word here is building on that. It says upadana, which is it's the ingredient cause that exists before and after material manifestation. So regardless of what happens and we go through the cycle of birth and death, there's still always going to be the Supreme Brahman or Lord Krishna. Finally, the last couple of things are avikrata, which it basically means it's not being subject to any transformation. So it's existing eternally, unchanged, despite countless manifestations or annihilations. So this word is important because Lord Krishna expands into the whole material and spiritual universe, right? So, but even though that happens, Lord Krishna himself or Vishnu himself is unchanged and is not subject to any change because of doing the expansion. And even when annihilation happens, when everything goes away, the only thing that remains is Lord Krishna or Supreme Brahman. So the last one is mentioned in the verses in the purports is Mridiva, which is all of this we can understand as the analogy of clay. So we can make clay into various different things, but at the end of the day, it can come back to being clay, and it's still just going to be clay. So just like that, the Supreme Lord is the underlying substance supporting all the spiritual and material realms. But so all of this, right? That what we can take away is the Shrutis are saying first that Krishna is the absolute truth. So the next, kind of building on this, there's a few other things that are in this verse that are also important. So Gajendra says, Namo namaste kilaya, namaste akilaya karanaya, namaskaranaya adbhuta karanaya, which means obeisances again and again to you, the source of all creation. You are the inconceivable cause of all causes, and of you there is no other cause. So again, what can we take away is that the Supreme Brahman, it's the Brihat, it's the greatest cause. There's no other causes other than that, and that's Lord Krishna. So again, the Shrutis are establishing the supreme person, the supreme position of Lord Krishna. So there's a couple of other things that we need to keep in mind here, just to differentiate between kind of Mayavad philosophy and what we think. The main thing, right, is to distinguish Prakruti from Purusa. So Prakruti is the external energy that constitutes the material universe, right? But Purusa is the source of Prakruti. So that's Purusa is the actual form of the Lord. That does not get impacted by the transformation of Prakruti. So why is it important to understand this? Is because those are two separate things, right? So if we have, if we kind of take Mayavadi philosophy, they say it's the same thing, that eventually all of it becomes the same, but it's not the same, because in the previous, the words that we went through, they clearly say that it's like clay, right? Just because it's going through some transformation, it's not going to change what it truly is. So similar to here, right? Prakriti is the material nature and the expansion, and it gets annihilated and transformed. But Purusa is the source of Prakriti. It doesn't change. It's Lord Krishna doesn't change. It's the eternal, and it's the ingredient cause. It's Satyam, or ingredient cause. So another way that we can understand this from the purports is that Lord Arjuna says it's Brahman is the effulgence emanating as rays from Krishna's transcendental body, and then Lord Krishna himself is Parabrahman, or the controller of Brahman, which are all the rays that are coming from his body. So this entire this verse and the verse before it and a couple of the verses after it are all kind of building on this idea of how Krishna is supreme. So the next verse, the Shrutis talk about a few things, and in the interest of time, again, I will go through just the translation. Therefore, O Master of the three worlds, the wise get rid of all misery by diving deep into the nectarian ocean of the topics about you, which washes away all the contamination of the universe. Then what to speak of those who have, by having spiritual strength, rid their minds of bad habits and freed themselves from time, are able to worship your true nature, or Supreme One, finding within it uninterrupted bliss. So, few things to keep in mind here. So the Shrutis have established, right, that Krishna is supreme. So then they say, okay, as material beings, and even the Shrutis, the way we can awaken ourselves and rid ourselves of material contamination and misery is by connecting the two things, right? So if we dive into the nectarian ocean of topics about the Supreme Lord, so by engaging in Shravanam and Kirtanam, it can wash away all the contamination of the material world. So the step one is understanding and hearing and talking about the Lord, singing about the Lord, and that's how we can first start to wash away the contamination. And that's the whole point of that, is to develop detachment from material nature, right? And from sense gratification. So the other thing this verse mentions is the key ingredient to doing this is the spiritual strength. And there's only couple of ways that we can get the spiritual strength. One is by practicing sadhana, right? And we had several classes in Mahatma Prabhu over the weekend. He gave the class about the importance of sadhana and how it's the foundation of everything that we do. And then the other thing is to surrender onto the spiritual master, right? So those are the only two things that we could do, and we have to do both of those things to be able to get spiritual strength. And without spiritual strength, right, we won't be able to ever escape the material contamination that we have. The other point here is we have to have association. And if we don't have association, then we won't be able to develop develop good habits and good sadhana to get to having some spiritual strength. And then the next part of the verse here talks about, moreover, if we can first hear about the Lord and then dive into the nectarian ocean of his pastimes, then we can get to the stage where we can start to develop good habits, right? And we can, by detaching from bad habits and freeing ourselves from doing karmic activities, we can start to purify ourselves. So we talk about the stage of anartha-nivritti, where we start to slowly cleanse our misgivings. So by attaching ourselves to Krishna, right, and by diving into Krishna's pastimes, it's one of the things that Prabhupada mentions. It's na karmana lipyate papakena, which means one thus avoids becoming tainted by sinful activity. So it's the easiest way to avoid sinful activity is to attach ourselves to Krishna. And going to the next verse here. So I'll just go through the points here, just so we can try to finish the other verses. So in this verse, right, there's again several things that the Shrutis are explaining. So in the last verse, the Shrutis basically said, okay, if you surrender to Krishna, right, then you'll be able to find uninterrupted bliss. So this verse, it's talking about the opposite. If we don't surrender to Krishna, then what does that mean? And we talked about this, and we've heard this on several classes, that if we don't surrender to Krishna, then our breathing, our material life right now doesn't have any meaning. It really is just it's empty without any true purpose, and it's illusory, and we are giving into illusion and giving into Maya without understanding our true nature and our true purpose. So in Ishopanishad, we talked about how if we don't surrender to Krishna and don't recognize Krishna, we are basically killers of the soul. We're the same as demoniac beings. So this verse talks about how if we don't have control over our material entanglement and our desires to have sense gratification, and we don't curb those things, then we'll forever be stuck in duality. We'll become a passenger of our sense gratification, right? So what that means is the mind will take us for a ride. We'll continue to fall down, continue to be entangled, and then we'll continue to experience karma and duality, whether that's good karma or bad karma. So what should we, the other thing this verse also says is Krishna is the underlying source of everything in the universe, right? So it says, you are the ultimate one, entering within the material coverings along with the living entity and assuming the same forms as those he takes. Distinct from the gross and subtle material manifestations, you are the reality underlying them all. So a couple of things to keep in mind, and this is coming directly from the purport, right? So Lord Krishna is manifests as Maya, right? As forms of Maya. And Srila Prabhupada explains kind of 5 levels of ego that are described in the verse, and and we should understand these because this kind of helps us see from how Krishna is helping us along the way to become spiritually enlightened, right? So there's 5 types of Maya or consciousness, right, that we get entangled and disillusioned in when we're in this material world. And the first one is Annamaya, where we have food consciousness or economic development consciousness, where we're primarily just concerned about um, you know satisfying our belly. Um, and then the next the next stage is once we've satisfied our food consciousness, right? It's pranamaya, which is the consciousness of self and one's existence. So this is where um, we have the ability to feed ourselves, but we don't have the ability to protect ourselves, maybe. So this is where we are defending against our existence and our annihilation. So we are trying to preserve ourselves. But we're still not concerned with anything else. We're just concerned with food and concerned with defending ourselves. Then the next stage is manomaya. So we've established that we have food, we have some sense of some sense of protection and some sense of stability. So then we then go to the next level of delusion, or not delusion, illusion, but level of consciousness, where um, we are engaged in mental speculation. So now we start thinking about, oh, okay, I have food, I have a place to live, I have all of these things, but now I need to start developing, um, using my skills to do other things, and using my skills to determine what is the value of my life, and um, what is the purpose of everything around us. So this is where we get into kind of mental speculation. But the thing to keep in mind here is this is all material, right? So all of this is we're still entangled in material nature. We're still illusioned by Maya. And Prabhupada says very clearly that this is where life stops for most human beings. We're satisfied with, you know, eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, and that's sufficient. And we're okay with um, is we're okay with the comfortable misery that brings. I think we've heard several times being called, comfortably miserable. So we are okay with we've gotten to the point where all of our basic needs are satisfied and we don't crave for anything else. But this is where I think Krishna consciousness comes in, right? So then we get to the stage of Atito Brahma Jnasa, which is we have to start inquiring about God. So the next 2 levels of consciousness are um, Vijnana Maya, which is spiritual inquiry leading to Paramatma realization, or any other realization. But it's where we are going through and undergoing purification of our consciousness. So this is where most personally, like where I feel myself to be, right? It's where we are progressing, we are understanding what some of these things are, we're starting to practice, and we are but the difference here is we are not fully solidified in understanding and surrendering to Krishna. And that's the next step, right? So that's Anandamaya, so that's bliss. So this is consciousness of bliss, where we are fully surrendered unto the Supreme Lord. We are free of miseries and full of bliss. So it's very nicely laid out for us here, and it shows how um, and the Shrutis kind of give way to this by saying that you know you are the covering that covers everything, not just external material, external potency of the Lord, but the internal potency and marginal potency as well, right? So this is where the consciousness that is between our jiva and the material world is even there. Krishna has these various stages of consciousness to help us get to finally surrendering on to Krishna. So we have this is and this one analogy here that I wanted to point out, was this is very similar to what many of us may know as like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Satyasara Prabhuji has mentioned this many times, but this is kind of a material understanding of the same thing, where we have, physiological needs, we have safety needs, and we have love, esteem, and self-actualization. So I don't want to go too much into this because we talked about the spiritual the Shastric explanation of this, but just an analogy that you may have seen. So what so building on that, right? The Shrutis make a very important they start adding on to this. So they first establish that the Supreme Personality, the Supreme Brahman is the source of everything. Then they've talked about what to do, what not to do, and this verse here talks more so about the our material jiva, the difference between the jiva and material entanglement. So in the last verse, right, it talked about the various stages of consciousness. So that consciousness is the covering that's on ourselves while we are in the material world. But and I'll read the verse here real quickly. So it says, the individual living entity, while inhabiting the material bodies he has created for himself by his karma, actually remains uncovered by either gross or subtle matter. This is so because, as the Vedas describe, he is part and parcel of you, the possessor of all potencies. Having determined this to be the status of the living entity, learned sages become imbued with faith and worship your lotus feet, to which all Vedic sacrifices in this world are offered, and which are the source of liberation. So the first thing that this verse kind of clarifies for us is that our jiva, which is our true identity, is actually uncovered it actually remains uncovered. It's not because it has access to all of these kind of levels of consciousness, and it can go from having just a consciousness of food to all the way to consciousness of Krishna. It's actually not covered. So our Srila Prabhupada says our jiva's souls are never directly touched by the coverings of ignorance and lust while passing through the repeated cycles of birth and death. So what's the true nature of jiva, right? We already know. We know it's part and parcel of Krishna, expansion of the large marginal potency, and that we have a very, very minute extent of the Lord's powers as our jiva. But the important distinction here is that while it appears that we are covered, we're not actually covered by anything, because we have access to all these levels of consciousness. So Prabhupada says that if we logically illuminate these material illusions and misconceptions, we can see that the covering that we have, or the false covering that we have on us, over us in the material world, is insubstantial, and that ultimately we are sparks of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So we can easily go back to Krishna, and we don't have to be entangled. We just have to make that step of surrender. So there's several verses. I know we're at time, so I'll just go through kind of the last verse here really quickly, that I think was important. Oh yeah, this is the verse I wanted to go through. So one thing that I think, the major thing that I took away from understanding these prayers was, in this verse, it's 10:87:23. I encourage everybody to read it. Prabhupada reveals the identity of who the Shrutis are in this verse, and he explains in the verse, the Shrutis pray that they want to be the consorts of Lord Krishna, and of the consorts of Lord Krishna. So actually, Prabhupada reveals that the Shrutis are actually the gopis of Raja in a different incarnation. So in this verse, they pray that they can experience, Madhurya Rasa in relationship to the Lord. And then in the purport, Prabhupada explains that eventually, through their meditation, they actually take birth as gopis in Vrindavan, and they're able to enjoy that Madhurya Rasa with and have that relationship with the Lord. So if anything I took away from all these verses was that, this is why the Shrutis are important. They eventually become gopis of Vraja, which is truly what we all, it's one of the rasas that we all hope to eventually attain. So I think at the end of the day, I mean, it's how do we answer the initial question? It's, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's to develop love for Lord Krishna and surrender unto Lord Krishna. And we have our way to do that. It's association, books, chanting, and following regulated principles and honoring prasadam. And Prabhupada has made it very easy for us to take up the path and also stay on the path through association, books, chanting, and diet. So with that, I'll stop there. We'll chant and be happy. So Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And apologies for going over time again. I only prepped 8 slides, but I only prepped 8 verses, but I think I again overestimated how much time it would take.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Mataji.
Yeah, really wonderful presentation. I mean, so deep, and you very nicely connected between the verses. And I think you pretty much summarized everything, but I'll just quickly tell 1 or 2 points. It's very nicely you said Shrutis, they confirm that Krishna is the absolute truth and he's the supreme, and spiritual strength we'll get only by serious sadhana and surrendering to spiritual master and association of devotees. So that's wonderful. And I really like how you explained the 5 levels of Maya and how one gets from the Annamaya stage to the final stage, the Brahmabhuta stage. That's what Krishna consciousness is all about. So very nicely you covered all the verses and the important points. And yes, the ABCD which Prabhupada has given to us, we should follow. And finally, the slide says chant and be happy. So wonderful. Thank you so much, Prashanth Prabhu. Very nice presentation. With that, devotees, thank you all very much for joining the BhagavatSanga program today. We will see you all next week. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prashanth Prabhu. I really liked how the essence of the chapter you beautifully explained, not only in this class, even the previous class. The essence is that the Shrutis give a very clear evidence that the Vedic literature is presented only for understanding the Lord and surrendering to the Lord. So that really, that theme you very nicely presented it. So I really liked it, Prabhu. Thank you very much. I really relished your class.
Oji, I am just regurgitating everything that I've heard from you and other devotees.
Thank you very much, Prabhuji.
Thank you, Prabhuji, for the opportunity.